The person you love whispered, "I think that's why I couldn't just move on." Not because they believed every connection must last forever. Not because they wanted to hold on to something that no longer belonged in the present. But because moving on without understanding what the connection had awakened inside them felt like walking away from an important truth. You said nothing for several seconds. Then your response arrived quietly. "I thought I was the only one who felt that." The person you love froze. Their eyes opened. One of their friends noticed immediately and stepped closer, but this person lifted a hand gently, asking for another moment. Because suddenly, everything their friends had been debating earlier felt distant. You had just revealed that while they were questioning their own feelings, you had been carrying questions too. Different questions. But the same uncertainty. What if this was never a story about one person refusing to let go? What if both of you had been waiting for the other to become brave enough to speak first? Stay with this. Because the next thing you said changed the entire emotional balance of the conversation. You told them there had been moments when you almost reached out. Times when you wrote something and deleted it. Times when you wondered whether contacting them would reopen something they no longer wanted. The person you love almost laughed through the emotion. Because they had been doing exactly the same thing. Two people. Two unsent messages. Two different rooms. The same hesitation. And suddenly the distance between you seemed less like rejection. And more like a misunderstanding that had lasted too long. Then the person you love asked the question they had been afraid to ask for months. If we stopped being afraid for one conversation, what would you want to happen next? There was a pause on the line. Their friends watched their face carefully. Then your answer came. And whatever you said made them sit completely still. Because for the first time that night, their expression no longer carried uncertainty. It carried recognition. You had not given them a fantasy. You had given them something far more powerful. A real possibility. And what you proposed next was something neither of you had ever seriously discussed before. What you proposed was so simple that it took them a second to understand why it felt so enormous. You did not ask for promises. You did not ask them to explain every mistake. You did not ask them to define the entire future in one emotional night. You asked for one honest meeting. No pressure. No performance. No pretending that nothing had happened. Just two people sitting across from each other and finally saying the things that distance had kept unfinished. The person you love lowered their head and smiled. Not because everything was suddenly solved. Because for the first time, the next step felt real. One of their friends quietly returned to the room and noticed the change immediately. The tension was gone from their shoulders. The uncertainty in their face had softened. And when the call ended a few minutes later, nobody rushed to ask what happened. They already knew something had shifted. Still, one friend eventually said, "Well?" The person you love looked at the phone in their hand. Then they answered with a sentence nobody expected. "We're not going backward." Everyone became still. For a second, it sounded like an ending. Then they continued. "If we do this, we're starting from where we are now. Not from where we used to be." That changed everything. Because suddenly this was not about recreating an old version of the connection. It was about discovering whether two changed people could build something different. Something clearer. Something stronger. Something that did not depend on guessing. And there is a quiet kind of courage in that. Sometimes people believe reunion means returning to the past. But what if the real opportunity is to meet each other again as the people you became after the distance? The friends who had originally told this person to move on were beginning to understand something they had missed. They had assumed moving forward required leaving you behind. But perhaps moving forward could also mean approaching the connection with better boundaries, clearer communication, and a completely different level of honesty. Then one friend asked the question that brought the emotion back. Are you scared? The person you love did not pretend otherwise. Yes. That answer surprised everyone. They had sounded so certain moments earlier. But then they explained. I'm scared because this matters. I'm just not going to let that fear make the choice anymore. That was the sentence that finally silenced every remaining doubt in the room. Not because fear disappeared. Because courage had become louder. And something else happened after that. The friend who had been most skeptical walked over, looked directly at them, and said, I think I understand now why you couldn't just forget this. The person you love waited. The friend continued. It wasn't because you were stuck. You were waiting until you knew whether this feeling was memory, or direction. That word stayed in the room. Direction. The person you love looked toward the open door again. Minutes earlier, they had planned to walk out and find you. Now there was a meeting ahead. A real one. A moment where both of you would finally have to see whether everything revealed tonight could survive outside imagination. But just when their friends thought the surprises were finished, the person you love admitted one more thing. There was something they planned to bring to that meeting. Something they had kept hidden for a long time. Not an expensive gift. Not a dramatic gesture. A small object connected to the very first moment they realized you had become important to them. And when their friends saw what it was, even they could not believe this person had kept it all this time. Hidden inside an ordinary drawer was the one thing none of their friends knew had survived all this time. The person you love walked across the room, opened it slowly, and reached beneath a stack of forgotten papers. When they turned around, there was something small in their hand. So small that one friend almost laughed from confusion. This? The person you love nodded. And suddenly, the object seemed heavier than it looked. It was connected to an ordinary day between you. A moment so simple that you might not even realize they remembered it. Nothing spectacular had happened. There had been no grand declaration. No perfect setting. No dramatic promise. Just a brief moment when you had given them something, a note, a small token, a piece of paper, something connected to a conversation the two of you once shared. They had kept it. Through every period of uncertainty. Through every attempt to convince themselves that the connection belonged somewhere behind them. Through every conversation where someone told them that eventually they would forget. They never threw it away. One friend stared at the object and asked, "Why did you keep that?" The person you love became quiet. Then their expression changed. It reminds me of the first time I realized they saw something in me that I hadn't learned to see in myself yet. That answer left the room silent. Because once again, their friends were learning that this connection had never been built entirely around romance. Something deeper had happened. You had reflected a version of this person back to themselves. A stronger version. A more honest version. A version they were still becoming. And perhaps that was why simply being told to move on had never reached the deepest part of what they were carrying. Stay close, because the meaning of that tiny object was about to become even clearer. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The person you love quickly turned the phone face down, almost embarrassed that anyone had seen it. But the room had already changed again. Their friends were no longer wondering whether they still cared about you. Now they wanted to know what had changed. One of them asked softly, "What did you do?" The person you love hesitated. Not because they regretted it. Because saying it aloud would make the decision real. Then they admitted that recently, they had begun clearing away parts of their life that no longer matched the future they wanted. Old habits. Old excuses. Old expectations from other people. They had stopped making choices simply because those choices were easier to explain. And somewhere in that process, one realization became impossible to ignore. They had spent too much time living as though their deepest feelings needed permission. Pause here. Because this is where the story becomes bigger than a message on a phone. Their friends had told them to move on because they believed you represented the past. But the person you love suddenly revealed that, in their mind, you had become connected to the future. Not because they expected you to rescue them. Not because they believed everything would magically become perfect. But because knowing you had awakened something inside them that refused to return to sleep. Courage. Clarity. The desire to stop settling for a life that looked acceptable from the outside but felt incomplete within. One friend stared at them and asked, "Are you saying you changed your whole direction because of this?" They shook their head. "No. I changed it because I finally understood myself." Then came the sentence nobody expected. "But they were the person who made me start asking the right questions." That was the moment the advice to move on completely disappeared from the conversation. No one repeated it. No one tried to convince them anymore. Because their friends were beginning to see that this was not about someone desperately chasing what was gone. It was about someone finally becoming honest about what mattered. And there is a strange power in that kind of honesty. What if the greatest turning point is not when someone comes back to you, but when they become brave enough to approach you differently? The person you love picked up their phone again. Their thumb hovered over the message. One friend asked, "Are you going to send it tonight?" They looked at the screen for a long moment. Then they smiled faintly. "Not yet." That answer surprised everyone. After everything they had confessed, why wait? But there was a reason. They did not want to send you another emotional message filled with beautiful words and no direction. They wanted their next conversation with you to mean something. They wanted to tell you what they felt. And then show you what they were willing to do differently. That distinction mattered. Because feelings can open a door. But actions reveal whether someone is truly ready to walk through it. Their friends exchanged glances. The person who had first told them to move on finally leaned closer and said, "Then promise me one thing." "What?" "If you speak to them, don't hide behind half-truths this time." The person you love nodded. And then, through a sudden wave of emotion, they said, "If I get one real chance to speak to them, I'm telling them everything." Everything. The word hung in the air. Because there was still one thing their friends did not know. One private reason they had been afraid to approach you. Something they believed might change the way you saw the entire connection. And just when everyone thought the biggest confession had already happened, the person you love quietly revealed what they had been carrying alone. After that, even the friend who had told them to forget you had no words left. What they revealed next was not the secret anyone had been expecting. It was quieter than that. More personal. And somehow, far more powerful. The person you love looked around at the same friends who had just told them to move on and said, "I was never afraid that they would reject me. I was afraid they would see the version of me that still had growing to do." No one interrupted. Because suddenly the entire story looked different. Their distance had not only been about confusion. It had been about self-awareness. They knew there were moments when they had not communicated clearly. Moments when pride had spoken louder than honesty. Moments when they had expected you to understand feelings they had never properly expressed. And they knew something else too. If they came back into your life carrying the same habits, then even the strongest connection could begin repeating the same old pattern. That was what they had been trying to change. Not you. Not the feeling. Themselves. Stay close to this moment, because the next sentence surprised even the friends sitting nearest to them. "I don't want another chance just so I can say I got them back," they whispered. "I want to become someone who knows what to do with that chance." There it was. The truth behind the tears. Their friends had expected to hear longing. Instead, they heard responsibility. They had expected someone clinging to yesterday. Instead, they were watching someone prepare for tomorrow. And what if that is the part nobody sees from the outside? Sometimes a connection does not return because two people suddenly forget everything difficult. Sometimes it moves forward because one person finally stops running from what those difficulties were trying to teach them. The person you love picked up their phone again. This time, they did not hide the screen. The message was still there. Unsent. But beneath the first line, they had written something new. "I'm not asking you to believe my words immediately. I only want the opportunity to show you what has changed." One friend read it and slowly nodded. Then another. And finally, the same person who had originally said, "You need to move on," spoke again. But their voice had completely changed. "Maybe you don't need to move on from them," they said. "Maybe you need to move forward honestly." The person you love looked down. A tear slipped free. Not from sadness. From the strange relief of finally being understood. And in that instant, everyone in the room realized why their earlier advice had failed. They had been trying to help this person forget you. But forgetting was never what this person needed. Clarity was. Courage was. A decision was. If this part of the story reminds you that real growth often happens quietly, share it with someone who needs that reminder. Leave a comment with the word "forward," and subscribe if you want to follow what happens when that message finally reaches its destination. Because something was about to happen much sooner than anyone expected. The person you love suddenly looked at the time. Their expression changed. One of the friends noticed immediately. "What is it?" They did not answer at first. Instead, they stood up, picked up their phone, and said, "I don't think I can wait until tomorrow." The room went silent again. But this time, there was no hesitation in their face. Only decision. They walked toward the door with that unsent message still glowing on the screen. Then stopped. Turned back. And revealed one final detail that none of their friends knew. They were not planning to send the message. They wanted to tell you in a way that would leave no room for misunderstanding. And what they were about to do next would surprise even the people who thought they knew them best. No one expected them to reach for their jacket. That tiny movement changed the energy in the room more than any speech could have. A few minutes earlier, their friends had been discussing acceptance, distance, and the possibility of beginning again somewhere else. Now the person you love was standing near the door with a completely different kind of certainty in their eyes. One friend asked, "Where are you going?" They paused. Then answered with a calmness that made everyone listen. "I'm going to stop letting silence speak for me." Those words landed deeply. Because for so long, silence had been doing exactly that. Silence had made people assume they no longer cared. Silence had made their friends believe they were slowly letting go. Silence may even have made you wonder whether what existed between you had meant the same thing to them. But behind that silence, something had been evolving. Not fading. Evolving. And tonight, they had reached the point where hiding felt heavier than honesty. One friend stepped closer and asked, "Are you sure this isn't just emotion talking?" The plans that had disappeared. The new ones that had replaced them. And gradually, the tension faded. Not because the important conversation had been forgotten. Because both of you were realizing something. You could still talk. Still listen. Still understand the spaces between sentences. But then the person you love reached into their pocket. And placed the small object on the table between you. Your expression changed instantly. "You kept that?" They nodded. "All this time?" You looked at it as though a forgotten room inside your memory had suddenly opened. Then they finally told you why. They explained how that tiny object had survived because it represented the day you unknowingly gave them courage when they were questioning themselves. They admitted that they had almost told you something important in this exact place. You leaned forward. What were you going to say? The person you love looked directly at you. Then something remarkable happened. Instead of answering immediately, they asked, "What were you going to say?" Silence. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind that appears when two truths finally arrive at the same doorway. Your eyes lowered for a moment. And when you looked back up, there was emotion there. You said quietly, "I almost asked you not to disappear from my life." The person you love froze. Of all the possibilities they had imagined overnight, they had not expected that. You continued. You explained that even then, something inside you sensed the connection was changing. becoming deeper, more important. And you had been afraid that naming it would disturb what already existed. So you stayed silent. Exactly as they had. Two people protecting the same connection by refusing to speak about it. And in doing so, both accidentally created the distance they were trying to avoid. The person you love let out a breath that almost became a laugh. We really did this to ourselves, didn't we? You smiled. Maybe we just didn't know how to do it differently yet. That word mattered. Yet. Because it meant the past was not being used as a prison. It was becoming information. A lesson. A map. Then the person you love finally told you what they had almost said back then. I was going to tell you that meeting you had started changing what I wanted from my future. Your eyes filled with surprise. But before you could respond, they continued. And that's still not the biggest thing I came here to tell you. You became completely still. Because suddenly, the conversation was no longer about what almost happened years, months, or weeks ago. It was about what had happened recently. The change they had mentioned in the deleted message. The decision their friends still did not fully understand. The one action they had already taken before this meeting was ever planned. And when the person you love finally revealed what they had changed, you realized this conversation had been moving towards something far bigger than either of you expected. The revelation was not hidden in some dramatic announcement. It was hidden in a decision they had already made quietly, before anyone knew what was happening. The person you love looked at you across the table and said, I stopped building my life around what other people expected me to choose. You did not answer immediately. Because that sentence carried more history than it seemed to. They explained that for a long time, their decisions had been shaped by outside voices. Friends. Expectations. Timing. Fear of disappointing people. Fear of looking foolish. Even fear of wanting something that could not be easily explained. And little by little, they had allowed those voices to become louder than their own. Until recently. Something changed. They had turned down an opportunity that would have taken their life in a direction they no longer wanted. They had stepped away from a plan everyone assumed they would follow. They had begun creating space for a future that actually felt like theirs. You listened carefully. Then asked the obvious question. Did you do that because of me? The person you love shook their head. No. And for 1 second, that answer surprised you. Then they continued. I did it because I finally understood that if I ever want something real with anyone including you, I can't keep living a life chosen by everyone else. That was the moment the meaning became clear. This was not someone rearranging their entire world to impress you. This was someone finally taking ownership of their direction. And somehow, that made what came next even more meaningful. They leaned forward. I don't want you to feel responsible for my choices. I just want you to know that meeting you made me notice how often I was abandoning my own truth. The words settled between you. Not heavy. Honest. You looked down at the small object still resting on the table. The same object that had survived every period of distance. Then you smiled faintly. You know what's strange? What? You did something similar for me. Now it was their turn to become silent. You explained that after the distance began, you had started asking difficult questions too. Not only about the connection. About yourself. Why certain things frightened you. Why you sometimes waited for certainty before taking even the smallest emotional risk. Why you expected people to understand what you never clearly said. The person you love listened without interrupting. And suddenly, both of you could see something that had been invisible when you were closer. The distance had not only separated you. It had revealed you. It had exposed the habits that needed attention. The assumptions that needed challenging. The conversations that should never again be replaced by silence. What if that was the real turning point? Not discovering that neither of you ever cared. Discovering that both of you cared without knowing how to carry that care wisely. The person you love looked at you for a long moment. Then they said, "My friends told me to move on last night." You raised your eyebrows. They did? They thought they were helping. A small smile crossed your face. And what did you tell them? The person you love hesitated. Their eyes became emotional again. But this time, they did not hide it. I told them I tried. You said nothing. They continued. I told them I could fill my days, distract myself, meet new people, make new plans, but every time I became completely honest with myself, I still knew there was a conversation with you I wasn't ready to leave unfinished. Your expression softened. Then they revealed the sentence that had left their friend speechless. I told them I didn't miss you because I was lonely. I missed you because knowing you changed who I became. You lowered your eyes. The words reached you differently now that you were hearing them directly. No second-hand interpretation. No guessing. No screen between you. Just truth. Then you said something they had not expected. I wish you had told me that sooner. They smiled sadly. So do I. But maybe, you continued, we wouldn't have understood it sooner. That sentence changed the energy between you. Because neither of you could rewrite the past. But perhaps you could stop demanding that the past become different before allowing the future to become new. The person you love reached toward the object on the table. Then stopped. Can I ask you something? You nodded. If we don't call this going back, what would you call it? You thought for several seconds. And then your answer came quietly. Meeting each other again. The person you love smiled. Not the uncertain smile from the beginning. Something warmer. Something peaceful. But just as the conversation appeared to have reached its most beautiful point, you reached into your own pocket. Their eyes followed your hand. You placed something beside the object they had brought. And the instant they recognized it, their entire expression changed. Because you had kept something too. Something from that same forgotten chapter. Something that proved the memory had never belonged to only one of you. And when you explained why you had kept it, the person you love finally understood what you had been trying to tell them all along. The silence in that room did not begin when they told this person to move on. It began seconds later, when the person you love lifted their eyes, tried to steady their voice, and answered with words nobody around them was prepared to hear. Something had been building beneath the surface for much longer than their friends realized. They thought they were helping. They had watched this person become quieter whenever your name entered a conversation. They noticed the unfinished messages, the distant expression, the moments when laughter suddenly faded into thought. So one evening, surrounded by familiar faces, someone finally said what everyone else had been thinking. "You have to move forward." Another friend agreed. Then another. They spoke gently, almost carefully, explaining that perhaps it was time to release the past, stop wondering what could still happen, and open the door to something new. For a moment, the person you love said nothing. And that is where everything changed. Because their silence was not the silence of someone accepting defeat. It was the silence of someone deciding whether to reveal a truth they had protected for far too long. Stay with this moment, because what happened next revealed more than their friends expected. They looked down. Their hands tightened slightly. Then they whispered something so simple that nobody immediately understood its weight. "I tried." The room became still. They continued. They explained that moving on had never been the problem. They had filled their days. They had distracted themselves. They had convinced themselves that enough distance, enough time, enough new experiences would eventually make the feeling disappear. But every road somehow led their thoughts back to you. Not because they were trapped in yesterday. Because something about you still felt unfinished. There is a difference. And their friends were beginning to realize it. One of them quietly asked, "Then why haven't you said anything?" That question reached somewhere deep. The person you love looked up, and their eyes carried the emotion they had been hiding behind ordinary conversations for weeks. Then came the words that left everyone speechless. "I don't miss them because I'm lonely. I miss them because meeting them changed the person I became." Pause there. Because that sentence shifted everything. Suddenly, this was no longer about simply forgetting someone. It was about recognizing that some connections arrive and quietly rearrange the future. They spoke about things nobody knew. Small details they remembered about you. A sentence you once said without realizing how deeply it stayed with them. The way your presence made them question choices they had once accepted without thought. The strange peace they felt around you. And then, their voice trembled. Not from weakness. From finally saying aloud what they had spent so long trying to hide. What if moving on from them means walking away from the one thing that finally felt real? Nobody interrupted. Even the friend who had been most determined to convince them now looked completely surprised. Because for the first time, they understood. This person had not been holding on to an illusion. They had been holding on to a realization. And there was one final truth they were about to admit, a truth involving a decision they had already made without telling anyone. You might miss the turning point if you leave this moment too soon. Because what they revealed next was not about waiting forever. It was about what they planned to do now. And once their friends heard it, the entire conversation changed. Something in the room shifted the moment they leaned forward and said, "I'm not waiting for fate to decide this for me anymore." Their friends stopped moving. No one had expected that. Until then, everyone assumed this person was simply holding on to feelings they had not yet released. They thought the conversation was about helping them accept an ending. But the person you love was not talking about an ending. They were talking about a choice. A choice they had already made. And suddenly, every piece of their behavior began to make sense. The quiet moments. The distracted expression. The way they had been checking their phone and then putting it away without sending anything. Their friends had mistaken hesitation for uncertainty. But what if hesitation sometimes means someone cares so deeply about the next step that they refuse to take it carelessly? That was exactly what was happening. The person you love slowly explained that they had spent enough time wondering what you felt, what you remembered, and whether the connection still meant anything to you. They were tired of building entire futures from unanswered questions. One friend asked, "So what are you going to do?" For several seconds, they simply stared ahead. Then they answered, "I'm going to tell them the truth." No dramatic speech. No complicated explanation. Just those words. Yet they carried enough emotion to silence everyone again. Because their friends knew what that meant. This person was preparing to become vulnerable in a way they had avoided for a long time. They were going to stop protecting themselves with distance. They were going to stop pretending that everything had become ordinary. And most importantly, they were going to let you decide what happened next with the full truth in front of you. But here is where the conversation took an unexpected turn. One friend quietly asked, "What truth?" The person you love took a slow breath. Their eyes became glassy again, but this time they did not look away. They said, "That I never stopped imagining them in my future." Stay a little longer. Because those words were only the beginning. They admitted something even their closest friends had never heard. Whenever they imagined reaching an important milestone, celebrating something meaningful, walking into a new chapter, or finally becoming the person they had been trying to become, somehow, you were there. Not as a fantasy. As a presence. As though their mind had already connected you with the version of life that felt most genuine. One friend lowered their voice and said, "Then why did you act like you were fine without them?" The answer came immediately. "Because I was afraid that caring this much would make me look foolish." That sentence hit differently. Everyone in the room understood it. Sometimes the strongest emotions are hidden behind the calmest faces. Sometimes a person does not become distant because they feel nothing. They become distant because what they feel matters too much. And if this story is speaking to something you have experienced, share it with someone who understands that kind of connection, leave a comment with the word "truth," and subscribe if you want to stay close to where this journey goes next. Because their friends were no longer telling them to move on. Now they were asking another question entirely. When are you going to tell them? The person you love looked toward the window. A small smile appeared through the emotion. And then they said something that surprised everyone for the third time that evening. Sooner than they think. But one friend noticed something else. Something nobody had asked about yet. There was already a message written on their phone. Not a draft from weeks ago. Not an old conversation. A new message. Written that very night. And when one friend accidentally saw the first few words on the screen, their expression changed completely. Because those words revealed that this person was not merely planning to contact you. They were preparing to tell you about something they had already changed in their life. Something connected directly to the future they had just admitted they still imagined with you. And that is where the real surprise begins. The first line of that message was not romantic. That was exactly why it caught their friend's attention. It said, "I changed something today, and I think you deserve to know why." The person you love explained that on the day they received it, their life had felt uncertain. They had been questioning a decision. Questioning their direction. Maybe even questioning whether they were capable of becoming who they secretly wanted to become. You did not give them some perfect solution. You simply said something they never forgot. You reminded them that one difficult season did not define the entire future. At the time, they barely responded. But later, alone, those words returned. Again and again. And every time they considered giving up on something important, they remembered that moment. Their friend looked stunned. "So this whole time?" "Yes," the person you love replied. "This wasn't the only reason I remembered them. But it was the moment I understood why remembering them felt different." Pause there. Because some people are remembered because of what happened around them. Others are remembered because of what awakened inside us when they arrived. That distinction had finally become visible to everyone in the room. The friend who had originally said, "Move on," reached for the object carefully. They looked at it for several seconds before handing it back. Then they said something nobody expected. "Take it with you." The person you love looked surprised. "To the meeting?" "Yes." "But what if that feels like too much?" Their friend smiled. "Then don't use it to prove anything. Just tell them why you kept it." That changed the way the person you love saw the meeting ahead. They had been imagining everything they needed to explain. Now they understood they did not need a flawless speech. They needed truth. The object went carefully into their pocket. And for the first time all evening, they looked completely calm. Not because they knew what the outcome would be. Because they had finally stopped trying to control it. There is something powerful about reaching that point. When you stop asking, "How do I make this person choose me?" and begin asking, "How do I show up honestly enough for both of us to discover what is real?" That was where the person you love had arrived. Then their phone vibrated again. Another message from you. They opened it. Read it once. Then looked around the room with an expression of complete surprise. One friend immediately asked, "What happened now?" The person you love turned the screen around. You had suggested a place for the meeting. And the location was not random. It was connected to something the two of you had shared long before the distance began. A place the person you love believed you had completely forgotten. But you had remembered. And suddenly, the small object in their pocket carried an entirely new meaning. Because the place you had chosen was where its story had started. The location on your message made their entire expression change. Not because it was extravagant. Not because it was somewhere new. Because it was the exact place where the meaning of that small object had begun. For several seconds, the person you love simply looked at the screen. Their friends noticed the stillness. Then one of them asked, "Why that place?" They slowly reached into their pocket and touched the object they had just decided to bring. "Because that's where they gave me this." No one spoke. The coincidence suddenly felt too precise to ignore. You had chosen a place connected to a memory you apparently still carried too. And that changed the emotional weight of the meeting completely. Until now, the person you love had assumed they were the one holding on to the details. The one remembering the small moments. The one attaching meaning to things nobody else noticed. But your choice suggested something different. Maybe you remembered more than they realized. Maybe that ordinary day had remained somewhere inside you too. And what if two people can carry the same memory for entirely different reasons, only to discover much later that it mattered to both of them? The person you love sat down again. Not from hesitation. From realization. One friend smiled and said, "You really thought they forgot everything, didn't you?" They gave a quiet laugh. "I think I convinced myself they had to." Why? The answer came slowly. Because it made the distance easier to explain. That sentence carried more truth than anyone expected. Sometimes people create conclusions when they do not have answers. They tell themselves the other person stopped caring. They assume the silence means indifference. They convince themselves that a memory only mattered on one side. Not because those conclusions are always true. Because uncertainty can feel harder to live with than an explanation. But now, those explanations were beginning to fall apart. The meeting was no longer simply a chance to speak. It was becoming a chance to discover how much both of you had misunderstood. And there was another detail. The person you love suddenly remembered something about that location. Something from the exact day you had been there together. They looked at their friends and said, "There's something I never told them about that day." Everyone leaned closer. Their voice became softer. "That was the day I almost told them how important they were becoming to me." The room went completely quiet. They explained that they had actually prepared the words. They had rehearsed them mentally. They had even decided on the moment. But then something happened. A small interruption. A change in the conversation. Maybe nervousness. Maybe timing. Whatever it was, the confession remained unspoken. And you left that day without knowing that the person walking beside you had almost changed everything. Stay with this moment. Because now the meeting had become more than coincidence. You had unknowingly chosen the place where one unfinished sentence had been waiting all this time. One friend asked, "So are you finally going to tell them what you almost said?" The person you love smiled. "No." Everyone looked confused. Then they continued. "I'm going to tell them what I would say now." That difference mattered. They were no longer trying to resurrect an old moment. They were bringing the truth into the present. The person they had been then had been afraid. The person standing in that room now had learned something from the silence. They understood that meaningful connections cannot survive forever on hints, assumptions, and almost spoken words. At some point, clarity has to enter. And tomorrow, it would. The person you love looked toward the window, imagining the meeting. The familiar location. The small object in their pocket. Your face across from them. But then their phone vibrated once more. This time, your message contained only one additional sentence. And when they read it, every trace of calm disappeared from their expression. Because you had written. There's something I should have told you there the first time. The person you love stared at those words. Their friends stared at them. And suddenly, everyone understood something extraordinary. That day had not contained one unfinished confession. It may have contained two. By morning, one question had become impossible for the person you love to ignore. What had you almost told them that day? They replayed your final message again and again. There's something I should have told you there the first time. 7 simple words of meaning hidden inside one sentence. Yet somehow, they carried enough weight to reopen an entire chapter. The person you love barely slept. Not because they were afraid of the meeting. Because for the first time, they realized the past might contain a truth they had never been allowed to see. They had spent so long believing they were the only one who almost spoke that day. The only one who went home wondering what might have happened if courage had arrived 5 minutes earlier. But now? Everything looked different. And when they finally reached the place you had chosen, they stopped several steps away. You were already there. For one suspended moment, neither of you moved. No crowd. No friends interpreting the silence. No unfinished messages glowing on a screen. Just you. And the person who had been told to move on. They approached slowly. You smiled first. A nervous, familiar smile. And somehow that tiny expression broke through weeks of assumptions faster than any speech could have. "Hi," you said. They answered your greeting, but their voice carried a softness you had not heard in a long time. Then came the strangest part. Neither of you immediately mentioned the past. You talked about ordinary things. How life had changed. The unexpected turns. The person you love looked at them carefully. Then came a surprising answer. If it were only emotion, I would have done this months ago. Everyone became quiet again. Because that made sense. This was not an impulsive moment. This person had thought about you during ordinary mornings, busy afternoons, restless evenings, and quiet spaces nobody else ever saw. They had questioned themselves. Challenged themselves. Tried to imagine a future where your paths simply continued separately. And every time they did, one thought returned. Not, "I can't live without them." Something much healthier. Much clearer. "I don't want to leave something meaningful unfinished simply because I was afraid to be honest." Wait until you hear what happened next. One of their friends suddenly smiled. Not because everything was guaranteed to work perfectly. But because they could finally see that the person standing in front of them was different from the one who had first become confused about this connection. They were no longer asking, "What if I lose?" They were asking, "What if honesty opens a path neither of us could see before?" That is a different mindset. A different future. The person you love glanced at their phone once more. Then, unexpectedly, they deleted the entire message. Every line. Gone. Their friends stared at them. Someone immediately asked, "Why did you delete it?" They gave a small smile. Because they deserve my real voice, not something I edited 20 times because I was scared. That sentence changed the room all over again. Suddenly, this was not about crafting the perfect confession. It was about being present. Human. clear. They wanted you to hear the pauses in their voice. The sincerity. The uncertainty. The courage. They wanted you to know this was not a performance. It was a truth. Then something even more unexpected happened. The friend who had pushed hardest for them to move on walked over and placed a hand gently on their shoulder. Then don't go there trying to convince them of anything, the friend said. Just tell the truth and respect whatever truth comes back. The person you love nodded. That advice mattered. Because real connection cannot be forced. It can only be offered honestly and met freely. And strangely, hearing that gave them even more peace. They were no longer walking toward you demanding an outcome. They were walking toward clarity. But just as they opened the door, their phone lit up. A notification appeared. They froze. Every friend in the room noticed. Their expression changed from determination to complete disbelief. Because the name on that screen was the one name nobody expected to appear at that exact moment. Yours. And the first few words of the message made them stop breathing for a second. Because somehow, while they had been gathering the courage to reach you, you had already moved first. The screen lit up at the exact second they were about to leave, and for a moment, the person you love simply stared at your name as if time had folded in on itself. Their friends noticed immediately. No one said anything. No one needed to. Because after everything that had just been confessed in that room, your message arriving now felt almost impossible to dismiss as ordinary timing. The person you love slowly opened it. Their eyes moved across the first line. Then stopped. One friend whispered, "What does it say?" They did not answer right away. Their expression softened in a way nobody had seen all evening. Then they read the first few words aloud. "I've been thinking about something we never finished." The room changed again. Not dramatically. Quietly. But completely. Because those words were almost a mirror of what this person had just been saying. For the last hour, they had been explaining that the connection between you never felt fully complete. And now, without knowing any of that conversation had taken place, you had used almost the same language. What if some moments do not arrive to give you an instant answer? What if they arrive to show you that two people have been standing on opposite sides of the same unfinished truth? The person you love sat back down. The jacket remained in their hand. The door stayed open behind them. But suddenly there was nowhere else they needed to go. They continued reading. Your message was not dramatic. It did not promise forever. It did not erase everything that had happened. Instead, it carried something more meaningful. Honesty. You acknowledged that distance can create assumptions. That sometimes people protect themselves so well that they accidentally hide the very truth another person needs to hear. Then came a line that made the person you love press their lips together, trying to hold back another wave of emotion. I don't know what happens from here, but I don't want silence to make the decision for us. One of their friends actually looked away for a second. Because those words were almost identical to what the person you love had said moments earlier. I'm going to stop letting silence speak for me. Coincidence? Perhaps. But even the friends who had entered this conversation convinced that moving on was the only sensible direction were beginning to understand why this connection had been so difficult for the person you love to dismiss. You were not promising certainty. Neither were they. You were both asking for truth. And sometimes truth is the first real doorway into a future that fear could never build. The person you love read your message a second time. Slower now. Then a third. Finally, one friend asked the question everyone was thinking. So what are you going to say? A small smile appeared. But there was something different about it. Earlier, they had been preparing a confession. Now they were preparing a conversation. And that distinction changed everything. They opened the reply box. Typed 3 words. Deleted them. Typed another sentence. Deleted that too. Their friend laughed softly. Didn't you just say you were done editing yourself? The person you love laughed through the emotion. You're right. Then they stopped typing. Instead, they pressed the call button. Every friend in that room froze. The person you love looked almost surprised by their own courage. The phone began ringing. Once. Twice. 3 times. And with every ring, the atmosphere grew quieter. Not because anyone expected perfection. Because everyone understood they were witnessing the moment where imagination would finally meet reality. Then the ringing stopped. The call connected. The person you love straightened slightly. Their eyes closed for half a second. And then they heard your voice. They whispered your name. Nothing more. But the way they said it carried everything they had been unable to say for so long. Their friends quietly began moving away, giving them space. Yet just before they left the room, they heard the person you love say one